to try to speak into it, Martyn, for a second? Yeah. Just say a few words of anything. Something
Just,
surreal.
Just a few words.
Oh, yeah.
Everything else will in next month, so don't go away immediately afterwards. It's important. Take a breath. I always have a problem at this part because we get some fantastic speakers and there's nothing I can't say that they can already do better themselves. When I've been wanting to do a Louise Michel talk in this place for years, and when I've heard these two speak about this or some other related issues in the past, I've been absolutely blown away. Constance also is a historian at Sussex University, isn't it? Sorry, I always get those. I am dyslexic. A dyslexic working in a bookshop, by the way. It's Surrey University. She's got a new book on transnational anarchism, which is an AK press or PM press.
Yes, PM. It's a reprint.
PM. So it's a reprint. So check it out. I think transnational anarchism is a really good idea because everybody was moving to and fro all the time. Martyn Everett, an independent researcher. I could go on and on about Martyn, but he's one of the key people in the anarchist research group that occurs in May Day rooms on the fourth Saturday of the month. So if you check Martyn's Facebook account, you'll get details about all of the upcoming events, and some of them are really very good. I'm going to leave it there because I don't think I could do them any justice that they can't do themselves. So please, again, stay at the end for a couple of minutes so I can make the other announcements, okay? Thank you very much. Oh, go on, hold on.
Oh, hi, Constance. Sorry, is your book on sale here today?
No, I don't think so. Sorry, we're looking for it.
We do have a good couple of book supplies, so we can order it in as well, so within a few days. But also trying to give a plug to Active Distribution because they're quite a unique set. They don't have their own shop and everything's online, so always check them out as well. So I'm going to pass you on. Thank you very much. Over to you.
I've drawn the short straw, so I'm starting. And I'm afraid to say that I have until recently been suffering from rather a nasty cold. So I hope that my speech is clearer than it appears to me. I've been interested in Louise Michel's school for quite some time. And so some of this people may have heard before if they've been to other occasions, but there is some new material that I've incorporated particularly for this evening, which I'd be very interested to get feedback on later on. But I'm going to shut up about that and just talk about Louise Michel for a few minutes. Louise Michel's international school lasted less than 2 years, but it was the most remarkable school in the history of London, pioneering new methods of education in late Victorian England and bringing together continental and British revolutionaries, early Fabians, and some of the individuals who shaped the history of progressive education in the first quarter of the 20th century. At least one police spy worked at the school, an agent provocateur who was instrumental in the Walsall bomb plot and whose actions resulted in the school's eventual closure. One of the best known and most colourful figures of the 19th century French anarchism, Louise Michel never wrote any major theoretical works. Her anarchism grew naturally out of her adventurous life. Born the illegitimate daughter of a chambermaid, she lived with her natural father's parents in rural France, developing a love of nature and a sense of personal mission to relieve poverty and correct injustice. As a young romantic poet, she developed a lasting friendship with the much older Victor Hugo and may even have been his lover. Louise trained as a schoolteacher and opened her own free elementary school in the village of Adelancourt in 1852. She subsequently moved to Paris, where she spent 9 years as a teacher at a public school, working under a directrice until in 1865 she established her own school in Montmartre. Her teaching methods were highly unusual as they lacked coercion. Louise believed in encouraging children to think for themselves and deplored punishment. Louise played an active part in the Paris Commune of 1871, organising a soup kitchen at her school. She helped the injured as a nurse on the ambulances tending the injured and the dying, and fought on the barricades alongside the National Guard in defence of the Commune. Louise's experiences during the Commune are important in several connected ways. She continued to teach during the Commune and became involved in the Commune's educational programme, which included the secularisation of schools, education for girls, and free education for all children. She worked with other women in the development of integral education, which emphasised learning through the acquisition of technical skills. Amongst these women were journalist Andrea Salmon and teacher Paula Minka. I hope I've got those names pronounced correctly because my French is appalling. Who both gravitated towards anarchism after the Commune and continued to promote integral education. It's important to understand that in France before the Commune, neighbourhood networks, complete with markets, fountains, washhouses and even secret societies, were instrumental in encouraging the emergence of a new public space where people were more concerned with the transformations of daily life than with political reform. Word of mouth and gossip turned the grid of women's neighbourhood contacts into the backbone of social movements. The creation of multiple gendered spaces contributed to establishing new social aspirations, which in turn resulted in women's heavy involvement in the practical social organisation of the Commune, its schools, hospitals, factories and revolutionary clubs, transforming the basic nature of everyday life through collective endeavour, rather than seeking a purely political transformation. Many women were also undertaking tasks normally carried out by men. These achievements validated Louise's feminist instincts and made her more aware of the revolutionary potential of women's self-organisation. After the collapse of the Commune, she went into hiding but gave herself up in order to free her mother, who was held hostage. With other prisoners, she was forced to march from Versailles to Sattery. Stopping along the way, some of the prisoners were woken in the middle of the night, made to dig their own graves, and then shot. An estimated 30,000 men, women and children were executed in the repression that followed the Commune, a massacre that held a personal tragedy for Louise, as amongst those shot by firing squads was the young revolutionary Théophile Ferret, who Louise had fallen desperately in love with. At her trial, Louise defiantly demanded that she should also be shot like many of the other communards, but she escaped the firing squads and was instead deported to the penal colony of New Caledonia on a dilapidated old frigate. On the long voyage, Louise was converted to anarchism during conversations with fellow women prisoners. In New Caledonia, Louise and the other women insisted on the same conditions as the male prisoners, even though these were far more severe. In exile, Louise took a keen interest in the lives of the indigenous Kanaks, learning their language and compiling a book of their folk tales. When a Kanak rebellion broke out, Louise sided with the Kanaks and actively supported their revolt. Amnestied after 8 years, she returned to Paris with other prisoners, plunging headlong into revolutionary activity, editing the anarchist paper The Intransigent, speaking at meetings and organising demonstrations. Vilified after the Commune, her support for anarchism now resulted in demonisation. Her refusal to compromise with injustice and poverty brought her frequent periods of imprisonment and at least one attempt on her life. Typically, Louise forgave her assassin and testified on his behalf at his trial. With Émile Pouget, the editor of the anarchist paper Pierre Pernard, Louise organised demonstrations against high bread prices. During one protest, she took bread from a baker's shop and gave it to the hungry, an action that resulted in 3 years in jail, most of it in solitary confinement. The French authorities also locked her up in a mental hospital, anticipating the Soviet policy that all who oppose the state must be mad. After release in 1890, Louise Michel went to London, where she spoke at demonstrations, often sharing the platform with William Morris and contributing articles to Commonweal, paper of the Socialist League. Radical journalist Henry Nevinson, who taught at the school occasionally, describes Louise at this time. Her old black bonnet was flung anyhow on top of her wild and copious grey hair, her enthusiasm, humour, and her green-grey eyes eagerly peering out on the world with mingled rage and pity and gentleness, which made one forget dress, age, and all. Louise provided help to other French anarchists living in London and organised support for those still in French prisons. Her spoken English was poor, so partly as a way of earning a living, she opened a school for the children of political refugees. The school used 2 rooms in the Autonomy Club in Windmill Street off the Tottenham Court Road and was open to children of all nationalities. Active fundraising soon enabled the school to move to larger premises in nearby Fitzroy Street. Now demolished, 19 Fitzroy Street was one of a terrace of elegantly respectable 4-storied houses built in 1790. The school received support from the wider socialist movement, especially from members of the Socialist League. William Morris paid for the costs of printing the prospectus, and Walter Crane provided the cover illustration. Inside the prospectus was an uncompromising statement of the school's aims. This school has been started by a number of comrades and friends who wish to keep their children out of the hands of those professors of modern school divinely inspired and licensed by the state, who teach consciously or unconsciously the popular sacrifice to the power of the state and to the profit of the privileged classes. In a word, therefore, the object of the school is to make free and noble-minded men and women, not commercial machines. This 19th century mission statement was followed by a quotation from Bakunin, probably the only school prospectus in the world to have a quotation from Bakunin in it. The whole education of children and their instruction must be founded on the scientific development of reason, not on that of faith, on the development of personal dignity and independence, not on that of piety and obedience, on the worship of truth and justice at any cost, and above all on respect for humanity, which must replace always and everywhere the worship of divinity. The prospectus also handily provided details of a wide-ranging curriculum that included French, German, English, science, music, drawing, geography, needlework, gymnastics, dancing, singing, carving, and technical education. In keeping with anarchist ideas, classes were not compulsory. Evening classes for adults were also held at the school and were a major source of income. Anarchism, and I'm now going on to talk about anarchism and education briefly. Apart from her own experience as a teacher, Louise drew on an evolving anarchist approach to education that can be traced from William Godwin, who gave a central place to education as a way of transforming society, through to the ideas of Proudhon, who developed a theory of integral education, where education and schools were to be closely related to work, with emphasis on the acquisition of practical skills. Practical skills were not, however, regarded as a substitute for the development of intellectual skills. On the contrary, intellectual development must be integrated into the learning of practical skills. The Paris Commune had made a short-lived attempt to set up an educational commission to coordinate educational reform in the various municipalities, proposing to secularise children's schools and establish proper professional schools that would provide workers with an integral education on Proudhonist lines, and this shaped Louise Michel's ideas about education. Although she never set out her ideas about education in any detail, it is possible to tease out an idea of what her possible pedagogical approach from her practice in schools in which she taught, and from the accounts of her life by other people, and from her own publications, particularly from her memoirs. And if you read no other book about Louise Michel, you should read her memoirs. It's a fantastic read. Nothing else matches it. During her first teaching post, Louise found provincial conformity stifling. She longed for a dynamic, intellectual atmosphere. Paris had lured her as the place where she could fulfil her destiny. There she became an assistant headmistress in the school of Madame Volière, where school teachers in the state system had to swear an oath to the empire. So she left to run her own private school, where she hadn't to swear an oath of allegiance to the empire. She used remarkably bold methods which anticipated the methods of new education a century later. She opened the minds of her pupils to concrete objects such as flowers and stones, and taught them to know and love animals. She taught herself at the same time as she was teaching the children. She eagerly attended night school where the women who during the empire were young school teachers or were preparing to be were greedy for that knowledge in which women can share only insofar as they snatch out at it with both hands. They came to quench their thirst for knowledge and liberty. A passion for knowledge possessed us. I believe more often than not we seemed like students, not like school teachers. This is, again, like Bakunin, seeing that the difference between school teachers and students should be abolished and dissolved into the process of a single process of learning. Although barely making a living for herself, Louise published at her own expense a pamphlet advocating education for the mentally handicapped. She bought her food clothes on credit, spending whatever money she had on music and books. She took up the study of physics, chemistry and natural history. In Darwin's Origin of the Species and in Claude Bernard's Introduction to Experimental Medicine, she discovered the foundations of scientific method and determinism. She declared herself an atheist and a materialist, but although the individual does not survive in a personal form, he still exists in the extent to which he has been able to devote himself to the human community, she said. In politics, she joined the International. The education of women was carried out in a professional school founded by Elisa Lemonnier, where Louise taught literature and ancient geography. She also turned her attention to the immediate relief of working women's poverty by founding the Société Démocratique de Moralisation, whose goal was to help women live by or return to work. Louise was never concerned with theoretical problems, but with furnishing workers with bread and jobs. While in New Caledonia, she not only taught the children of the exiled communards, but founded a school for Kanaks, teaching them to read and count, inventing special methods for their use. While there, she learnt to speak the Kanak language, music and songs, studied the plant life and collected their folk tales, some of which she later published. So there is a sort of experience that Louise drew on in the school that she opened in London. And now I want to sort of look at some possible aspects of her ideas that might have contributed towards a pedagogical approach. In particular, Louise placed emphasis on the solidarity created by oral culture, poetry and storytelling. From the family history she learnt as a child, to storytelling by women as they worked and sewed. Some of the most colourful passages in her memoirs are those which recall her lessons from her grandfather in the firelit hall of the ruined chateau where they lived, while the bats circled overhead at night. Her concern was to foreground oral culture, and it's closely linked to her interest in poetry. Her own written poetry, she claims, was inspired by the oral poetry of the Houtman, peasant women. She transcribes in its original patois the poetry of two young women of the fields, Nanette and Josephine, who Louise declared were the inspiration for her own poetry, which also came from the wind, the sound of the wind rolling over the land of the Houtman. Upon inserting her own poem in her autobiographical narrative, Michel states that she only did so in order to demonstrate the link between her own poetry and the peasant oral tradition that existed independently of the written word. Louise also connects oral culture to traditions of community resistance and made use of a highly oral style in her own memoirs. And in her memoirs, she highlights one particular moment during the fighting when she says, I was not the only person caught up in situations from which poetry of the unknown emerges. I remember a student who didn't agree with our ideas, although he agreed even less with the other sides, who came to shoot with us at Clamart and at the Moulin de Pierre. He had a volume of Baudelaire in his pocket, and we read a few pages with great pleasure when we had time to read. What fate held for him, I don't know, but we tested our luck together. It was interesting. We drank some coffee in the teeth of death, choosing the same spot where 3 of our people, one after the other, had been killed. Our comrades, anxious about seeing us there at what seemed to be a deadly place, made us withdraw. Just after we left, a shell fell, breaking the empty cups. Above all else, our action was simply one of a poet's nature, not bravery on either his part or mine. So there they are, sitting in the middle of the battle with shells and bullets whizzing around them, reading Baudelaire to each other, and completely oblivious. And in this little incident, you can see that she privileges poetry over physical fighting as a way, as something that's important in her life. She also emphasises gendered spaces in her writings, accentuating the importance of social structures in which women played a crucial role in her life at various times. The home and the village, the sewing circle and the circles of women that got together when they were washing clothes, at school where she taught and learned with women, the political clubs, the prison, all of which constitute a recognisably gendered discourse on her part. She was also interested in experimental methods in a variety of ways, particularly in music, for example. When she was on the island of New Caledonia, the deportees set up a theatre for themselves where they put on plays and operettas, and Louise tried to persuade them to mount another kind of spectacle entirely, in which the performers would be shaking palms, branches, clapping bamboos, sounding horn-shaped shells, and vibrating leaves with their lips. So she was anticipating the idea of found sounds from the environment, the sort of thing that John Cage pioneered almost a century later. She was also given an old piano for use in her teaching. Many of the keys were missing, but Louise, undaunted, turned the problem to her advantage, playing the piano, but getting the children to sing the missing notes. So again, you know, it's sort of a John Cage idea. You know, you put the music, you create music in the spaces that are available. And accounts by visitors to the school in London make special mention of the way Louise taught music with the children crowded round her and the piano in their noisy enthusiasm. And people always sort of took it as a sign of a lack of control rather than children's enthusiasm, you know, being so used to seeing children taught in regimented rows in the 19th century. She also pioneered in her poetry experimental methods, including collective writings, and she acknowledges in her memoirs the importance of a poem called The Black Marseillaise, which was not only a creative and collective enterprise, but also as a transitional text, distinguishing her writing from the master's voice by her evocation of the theme of class struggle inherent in her poetry. These verses, begun as a collaboration between me and Veramel, have been revised and completed by other friends with the same disdain for rhyme, but with expressions, they said, that were more appropriate for the circumstances, if the word appropriate expresses the thing. Her memoirs themselves offer tidbits of information about local culture, songs, sayings in patois, all imbued with a nostalgia for a pre-industrial, almost pre-literate French people. And the memoirs oscillate wildly among nostalgia, prophecy, narrative, and exaltation, disrupting linear narrative altogether. And she also adopted what we might now see as a sociological approach to social problems. In prison, she collected stories from the many prostitutes who were imprisoned at the same time, using what sociologists would now term a phenomenological approach, in which participants in research identify and describe events and circumstances for themselves. And Louise used this collected testimony to explain how poverty and male physical violence interacted to force women into prostitution. Her approach to high culture was also effectively countercultural, and she wrote plays and even an operetta. And some of the plays were performed by comrades on the prison colony of New Caledonia, and others by anarchist refugees at social events in London. The content was always highly political. When we tease out Louise's ideas, we can see a correspondence between them and the idea of weapons of the weak and the arts of resistance, which have been explained more recently by James C. Scott in his books Weapons of the Weak. Just a few quick words about the teachers at the school, who were an eclectic mix of Fabian reformers and die-hard revolutionaries had cut their teeth on the barricades. One of the Fabians who taught at the school was Margaret Macmillan, who later became an influential educational reformer. Geraldine Carr, one of the first teachers at the school, was also an early Fabian, but surprisingly married to a stockbroker. Agnes Henry, later a teacher and a suffragette. Victorine Brochet, a revolutionary French communard who'd once set up a cooperative bakery and who helped tend the sick, the injured during the Commune, and Henry Nevinson, the radical journalist, were all amongst the teachers at the school. The end of the international school was signalled by events in the distant town of Walsall, when in January 1892 the police snared several anarchists, accusing them of manufacturing bombs. Soon became clear that Auguste Coulon, Louise's assistant at the school, and its secretary, who lived on the premises, was an agent provocateur in the pay of the police. In spite of the Walsall trial, the international school continued to flourish, with over 80 children on the register and a similar number on the waiting list, unable to attend because of the lack of teachers. Evening classes had been started for the adults. Then, in April or May 1892, in the aftermath of the Walsall case, Louise arrived at the school to find the police searching the premises. A bomb had been found in the basement. One of the men came back up, Louise says. One of them was holding in his hand a sort of cylinder-shaped iron box. It seemed that this was a bomb. I did not want to believe it at first, but when I was shown the powder it contained, I was forced to accept the evidence. It was obvious that the person who placed it there had a reason. He wanted to incriminate me. In this he had succeeded. As a result, my school was closed down the following day. It was no doubt decided that I was giving my pupils an education contrary to bourgeois moral standards. The closure of the international school brought to an end one of the earliest and most remarkable experiments in the history of education. Against all the odds, Louise Michel and the London anarchists had managed to establish and sustain a successful free school in the heart of the city, pioneering a working model of alternative forms of education based on small groups and free inquiry without externally imposed discipline. Right, I hope that's not too much of a Cook's tour through the commune and the school, but look forward to questions later. It's over to you now, Constance.
Well, I'll start with a thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Housmans, and thank you, Martyn. It's really great to be here. It's so great to be here to talk about Louise Michel. She is such a delight, and it's just amazing to think she was so prolific, and there has been so much written about her, but yet there is still so much to discover. So what you were saying about her music and musical creation, that's very new to me, and I think there really is scope still to find out more about Michel, which is incredible, and all the more incredible if you consider how caricatured she has been very much, which is very much the focus of my talk. It's also great to be here to discuss her because, of course, we're just a stone's throw from her school and the haunt of the French anarchists in London. So it's very close, and that adds a dimension. But, of course, Louise Michel lived in London, or in, say, very Greater London, on and off for 15 years. She moved to London in 1890, and she travelled back and forth between Britain and France until her death in 1905 in Marseille. But she was very much an Anglophile, very keen Anglophile, very much an adopted Londoner, which is why she quickly moved out of London to a quiet, pretty little suburb. I think that's a sign of Anglicisation on her part. And so she lived, after some time, in what was known at the time as La Petite France, around Soho and Fitzrovia. She then moved to East Dulwich, where she lived between 1893 and 1895, then Sydenham, where she was still in 1902, and then a year later we find her in Streatham. And quite a lot is known about where she lived. If you go online, you can see photos of her house. So there is a bit of, say, Michel tourism, or quite a lot of, I would say, activist knowledge about Michel, but still, it's a very much under-researched period of her life and activism, and I think there is a point to this. There are several deep rationales which help to explain why this has been understudied. So the first one really is about her trajectory post-commune. Michel very much belonged to the Republican pantheon in France, and as it happens, you might know that in France, the grandees of the Republic are buried in the Pantheon, which is in the Latin Quarter, and there have been long debates in the last few years as to whether Michel should be included in this monument, because of course they were looking to include more women, and Michel was one of the most prominent one. So she has very much, ironically, become an iconic Republican figure in France. Many schools have a name. There are Louise Michel squares in many cities, and that's very much her incorporation into the Republican narratives. And I think that has precluded really research into her anarchist, period, a period which lasted about 20 years, so a substantial period. But the narrative has been very much overawed by her communard, activism, and earlier period. Of course, people interested in anarchist history know a lot about this, but I'm not sure it's really seeped through across academic fields and activist narratives. The other reason, I think, there are two other reasons which I see as foundational for this obliteration of her time in London. The first one is a misunderstanding, really, as to what constitutes activism outside the framework of the nation. So that's very much my work on transnational anarchism, and this idea that in order to understand the anarchist movement, we need to look beyond and across borders and to see what people did when they moved. And I think Michel, of course, is very much studied in France, and that's what I base my comments on. But I think for many French historians, I'm not going to make many friends here, but if you're outside France, then you're not doing much, not much is happening, and that has really precluded studying a lot of what she did, which really happened in this to and fro movement between France and England. The third reason, I think, is very much about gendered activism and the fact that some of her forms of activism were typically feminine or were less obvious, perhaps, than in some accounts. Say, in some male-dominated forms of activism. So, again, this is something which has led to overlooking some of her activities. So, one of the points I will develop here is that she was an incredible networker across, of course, the anarchist movement, which was thriving in London at the time. There were anarchist groupings from everywhere in the Western world, and she knew everyone, and she worked across languages, which was quite unique at the time. But she also worked across political movements. You mentioned the Fabians working at the schools. We have, in her correspondence, there are invitations from the Women's Institute inviting her to come over. There are invitations of very well-to-do Edwardian women as well, inviting her for tea. So she really worked across social circles and political boundaries, and this was very unique. But I'll come back to that. And of course, the main reason, which has really obscured what she did, was, I think, a certain readiness to look at her very unkindly and to dismiss her style. She was certainly a very dramatic character, but this has resulted in her being portrayed as a very emotional person. She was completely caught up in gendered stereotyping, and so the main impact of that has been to think that she was deeply emotional and had no political consistency, whereas I think what you've really shown, and that's also what I would like to show, was how coherent and consistent she was. She was incredibly principled, and she really had a strong set of beliefs which were very coherent, but somehow in the whole focus on her emotional and very, well, as she used to be portrayed at the time, hysterical nature, this has got lost in the narrative. So I'll give a few examples here to show what I mean. So Georges Clemenceau, who was, well, initially not an anarchist, but a socialist activist who later became Home Secretary in France, summarized her militancy as follows. Where is Louise Michel going? I have no clue, and neither does she, most likely. She goes instinctively to all that laments, suffers, and misery. End of citation. So typical, she is emotional, she doesn't know what she's doing. And then I have another one from her touring companion, Ernest Giraud, with whom she was on tour when she died in Marseille. Quote, she is dead, and nothing remains of her philosophy, just like nothing will remain of the apostles of sheer goodness, mere sentimentalism. At the historical moment, their influence only counts as a spurt of sympathies. Unquote. So it's all about Michel being emotional, irrational, sentimental, deviant, etc. So what I'd like to do is to highlight three aspects of her time in London, three activities. There was a fourth one, which is the school, but I think, Martyn, you are the absolute expert on this, so there is nothing else to add. But I think we very much have the same line, which is to show that she was so incredibly consistent as an activist and a revolutionary. So my first point really is about her day-to-day activism in London, print propaganda and meeting propaganda, in which she was incredibly prolific. I'm looking for, yes. So in London, so when Michel arrived in London in the early 90s, the place was pretty much the headquarters of the French anarchist movement, whose centre of gravity had moved to London because of repression in France. And she was very active when she was in London, so she published a lot. She published a very famous volume, The History of the Commune, which was serialized in the London-based periodical Liberty, published in Hammersmith by James Tocati. And it was published in France after its initial publication in London. She also contributed to many English-language anarchist papers, such as Liberty and The Torch. The Torch was being published, I can't remember where exactly, but by... Of course, they shared the premises of freedom for some time. Sorry. And yes, so published by the Rossetti children, very original undertaking in Victorian anarchism. So she contributed to that. And there's quite a lot written about Michel in the memoirs of the Tocati children, some of it not particularly flattering, again, that sort of stereotyping, but she was involved in this. She published some of her poetry in there. So alongside her historical, political output, there was her literature material. She also published in Liberty an article called Why I Am an Anarchist, which was part of Liberty's series of Why I Am, so Shaw published in the same series. So she was very active in those circles. She was also active in the circles of French exiles in London. So one Charles Malato, who was absolutely delightful French exile, Franco-Italian anarchist, who was in London at the time publishing a paper called Le Tocsin, the Alarm Bell, which was a standard anarchist paper title at the time, and she published there. She also published in the French anarchist press, Le Libertaire, based in Paris, an iconic French paper. And in Le Libertaire, she used to report back a lot on the London colony and the life of the exile groups. And that was a constant interest of hers, the life of the London groups and of these exile groups, which were extremely marginal. Another area of interest for her during that time was, of course, the question of political violence. That was the time of propaganda by the deed. There were terrorist attacks instigated by, linked to anarchists sweeping over France, Italy. And Michel had expressed support for anarchist terrorists, and she was branded by the French daily Le Matin as an apostle of crime for doing this. And this really added to this notion that she was a very violent woman, a firebrand, etc. And of course, this accusation of irrationality, violence, was used to tar the anarchist movement. But if we look more closely, you can see that her positions were aligned with some of the leading exponents of anarchists at the time. So even Malatesta, of course, she was nowhere near as consistent a theorist as Malatesta, but she did raise similar questionings regarding ends and means in revolutionary strategies. And this has been completely brushed aside in favor of, I admit, perhaps more alluring myths that she was just, your classic anarchist dynamitar. So she was also very active in open-air meetings at the time, and she was very much the superstar of the anarchist circles. The phrase superstar is not mine. It's been coined by her biographer, Edith Thomas, whose biography has been translated into English, and it's very, very good. But she really had this star appeal, and it meant that she could also bring a lot of money for the anarchists, which I think is an area which has not been looked at enough, which is the whole finance of the anarchist movement at the time, because there was a lot of solidarity. People would attend open-air gatherings or performances. There would be collections at the end, and Michel could really draw in the crowd. And she was such a passionate internationalist. We find in archives many documents asking her to come and talk about internationalism and, preach the good word. And she would draw these international crowds in London. She would share their platforms with Kropotkin when he made fairly rare appearances, Rudolf Rocker, as you've mentioned, William Morris. There were a few women in these circles, so Charlotte Wilson of the Freedom Group, Agnes Henry, as well, visitors from America, Lucy Parsons, Emma Goldman on occasion, but she was the one woman who was there and who had this very unique appeal. So I think even that, there is a lot of coherence in that. She was clearly a very committed activist who wanted to spread the word in whichever way she could. And her citations, though many, were always extremely consistent. And I think this has been overlooked. If you read contemporary press, but also things written by anarchists, tended to be quite dismissive of her style. There is a lot written about her public performance style, and a lot of it is quite derogatory. Apparently she droned a lot. And many people find this extremely off-putting, and she used to make very emphatic gesture. And again, it's a matter of form versus content and how it's sort of drawn the attention away. The second point is, as I mentioned before, it's about sociability, and really how she enacted through her sociability in London her political ideals of solidarity and internationalism. And there is a lot about her and how she created and supported networks of support, and especially for women. In her correspondence, we find a lot of material where she tried to approach other women to seek support for other women who were often destitute. And the money aspect, again, is very important, and she would always try to find money for women who were at a loose end. And she herself, despite having this great earning power for an anarchist, lived in poverty, and she was very much supported financially by her great friend Rochefort, who was a slightly shady figure, but she really liked Rochefort. They had been comrades in deportation in New Caledonia, and they remained faithful to each other through that, even when he moved to the far right and supported monarchist coup in France and etc. But he supported her, and she gave all she had to people who needed it. So I have a quote here from sorry, I just need to find it, from a journalist who walked with her in London and noticed that, because journalists used to approach her all the time to shadow her. Journalists came from France to interview her, and from the British press as well. So this journalist, actually it was a French one, sorry, so had come to London, and he followed her, and he reported that, quote, "To every beggar passing by, Michel stopped and gave a penny, so that after 15 minutes her purse was empty and she resorted to mine," end quote. And this was very characteristic, and there's this great selflessness about her. And the flip side of that coin comes from Peter Kropotkin, who, of course, didn't look particularly favorably upon this. He was the guardian of sort of high anarchism, and he writes to Alfred Marsh at the Freedom Group, quote, "That Sunday, Louise Michel came to me with 2 Frenchmen whom she brings with her from Paris, absolute strangers to her and to any one of the comrades. Both produce a most unpleasant impression. Both are not anarchists. Louise, with her usual good-naturedness, has even promised them to have their paper printed in the Freedom Office. With people who use Louise to enter into our acquaintance, we have all reasons to be doubly on our guard," end quote. So that's the flip side. Overly generous, but for her, I think it was clearly about solidarity, generosity, and networking. And she was really an avid, and I think quite shrewd and quite savvy networker. So I mentioned the cross-class. I think you've really discussed the cross-political aspect, but the cross-class is an interesting one as well. And this is an anecdote reported by Margaret Macmillan, who worked at the school, and recalled an encounter between Michel and one Lady X, who had been, I quote, "amused by stories about Louise and invited her to her house in Park Lane. Michel went," and Macmillan said, "being, I think, under the delusion that Lady X was converted to anarchy," end quote. And so, of course, it's just, you can say it's just anecdotal, but it does speak to Michel's status in British society, but also the fact that she knew how to use it for the advantage of the movement, and she drew a lot of support, financially, but also reputational, at a time when the movement was in a very precarious position. So that's an interesting aspect as well, which I think needs to be reconsidered and rescued from the narrative of Michel as the crank. I'll finish briefly on Michel's activism surrounding asylum. So all these French, Italian, Spanish anarchists, or Eastern European Jews were living in London, which was at the time the last remaining great European asylum, and was becoming increasingly precarious under a number of pressures. And Michel was very aware of that. So, as I've mentioned, she was a very fond Anglophile, and she had this idea that Britain, despite being a monarchy, was far more liberal than Republican France. And this was a topic she came back to throughout her time when she went to France to lecture. So I'll quote a spy report who was reporting on one of her lectures in France. "Michel started by talking about the freedom people have in England to gather as they please. She pointed out that in some meetings, when there is considerable attendance, people are never afraid of running into trouble with the police. On the contrary, they protect meetings." And there are lots of quotes along the same line, and she'd really chosen to come live in Britain and away from France because of the obsession of the police. She was subjected to intense scrutiny, almost, interned in a hospital because she was suspected of early dementia. And she had made that move to London very consciously. I really appreciated these freedoms. And she tried to preserve this asylum. There were a few high-profile cases surrounding these French exiled anarchists in the early 19th early 90s, including in 1892, a case where the French government asked for one exile known as François to be sent back to France because he was suspected of terrorist involvement. And Michel really organized the support networks for François. She raised money, she led a press campaign, outdoor meetings, street agitation, hired a British solicitor, I believe, I don't know, but she really tried to navigate the high politics of exile. So the case failed and François was extradited, but it really shows that she had this awareness of the high politics of asylum at a time when it was very much threatened. But at the same time, she was very much at the grassroots, and one of her aborted projects was the organization of a shelter for the French exiles and the international exiles, much like the school. I think there was this sense of creating facilities to make their day-to-day lives more tolerable. And she had this idea of this Maison des Proscrits, and she wrote in the French paper Le Libertaire about it in 1895. I have formed a beautiful project. My dream is to set up in London a large refuge house offering shelter to all exiles, the Maison des Proscrits. It is to London that all those forsaken and exiled by their homelands run for shelter. They find freedom there, but most of them, alas, cannot enjoy it, having nothing to eat. Oh, so many unsuspected miseries I have seen. Ah, ma Maison des Proscrits. So this never came into being, but she did raise some money. She located a piece of land, and it was going to go along the lines of a commune, which was another strand of anarchism at the time, but it didn't. But it still shows, again, great consistency, this concern with organizing the community, creating facilities. So again, great deal of coherence, a very, I think, substantial and principled activist, and I think that's a narrative that really deserves to be reclaimed.
Thank you very much.
So we've got a Q&A session, but the usual routine, what we do is if anybody wants to ask a question, I'll come round and give you a microphone, because so then everybody can hear what you're asking. Again, if you don't want to be seen on this camera is now, is this camera now active? So what we do is if nobody wants to be seen, speak to Simon at the end, and he'll make sure your face and your characteristics are blocked. So don't be shy about speaking to him. Anybody? Anybody got any particular questions to start off with? This is the danger about being so thorough. Then everybody feels so satisfied they don't really, they don't have any questions.
What were the? Let's use the microphone so everybody can hear you. I didn't quite get the.
What were the revolutionary groups she was involved in communally? You said when she was living communally back in France, in women's revolutionary groups. What was the nature of those?
Well, she wasn't
were they like sewing circles that did other things? What were they?
Well, no, things like those were the way in which society in French villages was organised when she was younger. So, and then later on, there were various clubs that were in revolutionary Paris, where the women had their own clubs. And they weren't communes, but they were places which were predominantly organised by women, women's spaces. So sewing circles where people got together, did the sewing, and at the same time they would gossip about their neighbours, they would tell stories about men to avoid in the village because they were trying it on or something like that. They would talk about the price of food, all these kind of things. And we know from feminist research that gossip is not just something that's malicious, but which is something which is a way of spreading news about events, about what is happening in society, what's happening in the village, and something which is was very, very important to the organisation of women in rural societies.
Just take this off so then you can share it. Have you got any thoughts, Constance?
Sorry?
Do you prefer Constance or Connie?
Constance.
Have you got any thoughts, Constance?
About this, so I think gendered activism, I agree. And I think you're right, there's quite a lot of research about this. I call it relational activism. Sorry, that's very jargony, but this idea that making contact with people is a form of activism, and it's very much connected with women's activism. You make contact, it's solidarity network, it's a way of sharing information. I think that's very true of her. But yes, so we completely agree on everything. That's amazing.
Can I just ask, I mean, obviously you've really done a great job of talking about gendered aspects of this. Was there anything lesbian and gay or about any ethnic minority groups or what have you?
Gay.
Sorry.
No.
I think I just threw a blinder there, and please forgive me.
No. There's her own relationship with Charlotte Vauvel. I think there's been so much speculation, I think, about her own sexuality, really, from her, from Victor Hugo to Ferret. That was really the stuff of legend. And then when she was in London, so she lived with Charlotte Vauvel, who was always referred to as her compagne. So very ambiguous. There were undertone. It's difficult to know where to draw the line between, what was clearly derogatory. And there were so many caricatures about her femininity or lack thereof. So it's difficult to draw the line, but there's no doubt that most discourses on Michel were fraught with implications about her sexuality, definitely.
People? Oh, good. Right.
Hi, you said earlier about her being derogatory labelled as a firebrand to kind of criticise her more theoretical aspects. I'm not saying I'm not commenting on her theory, but was she actually? Do you consider her a firebrand? Not in a way of saying that was all she did, but was she very? Well, I don't know. As a person, did she come across from your readings as quite passionate and not necessarily aggressive? I don't know what I'm asking. Thanks.
Yeah, fair enough. Definitely very passionate, and she had that style of writing that was really quite apocalyptic when she wrote about the revolution. Definitely very hyperbolic, but the hyperboles were very consistent. I think that's the main point, and it comes back. And there are themes that really weave everything together. For instance, universalism. So, of course, it lends itself to endless sweeping metaphors, this kind of things. But yes, I think, of course, we can't go too far the opposite way. She was in Kropotkin.
I think that one thing we mustn't forget is what Constance mentioned before, that Louise Michel managed to draw large crowds and raised a lot of money, and there is an extent to which she had a public profile as a performer, and a lot of her most fiery rhetoric is on the speaker's platform and in the press, where she's writing for a wider audience. We must also not forget the 30,000 colleagues that she had, comrades that she had, that was slaughtered during the Commune. And when strikers would be shot down in the streets in French cities for going on strike. And so that to call for vengeance, which is one of the words that she often used, is not surprising. You're not going to sit down and ask the president to have a game of tiddlywinks. You're going to be outspoken. You're going to remind people that this is a class war. And you have to contrast that with the other side of her personality. Again, it may have been performance, I don't know, but the woman who comforted a dying horse in the street, the woman who gave her coat to somebody else, that these are part of the myth of Louise Michel. They may be part of the performance of Louise Michel as well. But she was certainly very much a quiet person in much of her own life, a private person. That's why we don't know much about her relationship with the woman that she lived with.
Go for it.
Firebrand, one of the early post-war books in English that featured prominently Louise Michel, was titled Les Pétroleuses. So I've inexcusably typically arrived late. Maybe you covered this before, but it was decades ago that I still have a copy of it somewhere. But I mean, to what extent, in relation to Comrade's question, to what extent would you consider, can it be said that that label had literal validity with regard to her?
One of the things that we have to remember is that part of what happened at the end of the Commune was part of the vilification of the communards. It was also, we have to remember the end of a battle, the sort of street by street fighting in which buildings were bound to be set on fire, and there were some talks about people using petrol as a weapon, and Louise Michel did claim during her trial to have been guilty of this, but she also claimed to be guilty of all the crimes that other people had committed, and it was quite common for the people who were put on trial, particularly the more prominent people, to take on the crimes that other people, in inverted commas, the crimes that other people were accused of, because they were already possibly facing a death sentence anyway. So by pleading guilty, they could help other people escape the consequences of repression.
Sparks the thought that maybe the Je suis Charlie phenomenon then spread into the English-speaking world subsequently, like I am Julian Assange is one example. That may have had its origin at that time. The communards claiming collectively or individually that they were individually guilty and proudly so of all the crimes of which they'd collectively been accused.
If my memory of that book about the petroleurs is correct anyway, Louise is only mentioned in passing in it, and not actually one of the key kind of characters discussed in the book. And the book was also by Edith Thomas, who wrote the very extensive and detailed account of Louise Michel's life, and she doesn't talk about Louise as being one of the petroleurs either. So I think that we could possibly assume that was not something that she did. But in the aftermath of war, who caught up in a situation like that in Syria could forgive somebody for taking up the gun to defend themselves or whatever weapons lay at hand.
Constance, beg your pardon.
Thank you. I think for the anarchist period, it's a different context. Obviously, there's no continuity, and stepping into action was a different problematic. I think I think to some extent she was for a sort of anarchist leader. Sorry, that's a very hideous term, of course, but one of those, she belonged to this elite. Mentioned Kropotkin, we mentioned Pouget earlier, Malatesta, or the London crowd. I think she was probably one of the most active or determined, as the police report said, and she had no hesitation doing things, but many of them did at the time. I think you always come back to stereotypes and the way she was portrayed. I think just because of the threat, really, she was embodying for many people. So her power was really great. And I think that's why there was always this question of whether she was a firebrand or willing to take action, because many of them did. Many of them were suspected of terrorist involvements, of being involved in plots, etc.
Yeah, I'm interested in the concept of finance and funding anarchism, and it's rarely talked about anywhere I go to, and it probably should be. All other political campaigns and activities always looking for lots of money, including Extinction Rebellion, who didn't go anywhere until they'd raised loads of money. Any lessons to be learnt from Louise Michel and the relationship she had with money and political campaigning and funding, and anything we can learn about raising funds today?
Well, I think the question with Michel is unfortunately what happens once you've raised the funds, because she was really exploited by anarchists, and I think that's something that hasn't been looked at, and there is something to do surrounding really the time of her death that, again, I'm surprised it hasn't been done, but they really squeezed every penny out of her, and I think she was quite a willing victim. So I think it's more about money management in radical movements. In terms of fundraising, yes, good PR, showmanship. I think that works. That's ER, they know about that. And solidarity, there's a very good book that's just appeared in French, and I really hope it gets translated. It's by Nicolas Delalande, and it's about solidarity across the far left in Europe and the Western world throughout the 19th century until the Second World War. And he talks a lot about money and the ethics of giving, collecting money, how it's done. And I'm sure there are lessons there as well.
Money and anarchism, that's quite a problematic thing, even in the 19th century. The school was funded partly by evening classes, which there was a charge for. The school was also funded by things like anarchist choirs giving concerts in the Athenaeum, all sorts of events like that might have been undertaken to raise small sums. But there's also, at the same time, there was also a very much more pragmatic attitude that you might see developed among some of the anarchists involved with the Socialist League, like Joseph Lane and Frank Kitts. For example, Lane and Kitts and Mowbray would take out they would rent a room somewhere in a neighbourhood, and they would move into it, and they would set up a printing press. They would rip up a paving stone to make the inks for their printing press, and they would stay there until the landlord managed to evict them without paying rent, and then they would do a midnight flit, leaving the paving stone behind them. There's also the apocryphal but true story of with the end of the Socialist League, Frank Kitts, who was always fairly impoverished as somebody who depended upon work for his livelihood, he sold off the Socialist League archive, and it was sold to a rag and bone dealer, somebody who reconstituted paper, and everything had actually been ripped in half and put into the baskets where it was going to be dipped in vats to sort of break all the fibres down again. And Max Nettlau heard of this and rescued the archive, and it was only joined together again about 20 years ago in Amsterdam. But for all the rest of the time, it was all ripped up in pieces where the rag and bone people had sort of ripped it up because he'd been wanting to make a penny and didn't know what to do with the archive. So obviously the money didn't always percolate to all parts of the movement. So
be right with you, Rose.
Yeah, I'm wondering about how any of us leave a permanent legacy or influence into the future, and compared to, say, with William Morris, with all his arts and crafts and what he wrote, I'm wondering whether you see any lasting legacy or influence of Louise Michel. And also I wondered, Michael, the book, the shop has her memoir that Martyn was recommending for people to buy after the meeting.
I'm 99% certain we don't actually have a copy of it just now, but I'll certainly speak to staff, email the staff, and we'll get them to tweet it so people know that it's available in the shop. Anybody else? Anybody? Go on. Oh, Mr. Carroll. Oh yeah. Okay, let's go do a couple at a time, but go on, far away.
I think that's a very good question. I would say Michel is up there with William Morris. She's very well remembered. Social media, to see the response to today's event, I was amazed. One of my colleagues came up to me. He's a Greek colleague, and he teaches translation. Said, "Oh, I see you're speaking about Louise Michel." I thought, my goodness, how does he know about Louise Michel? And I don't think that's a problem for her. I was thinking more of the sort of middle tier anarchists who were very active at the time. So you mentioned Émile Pouget. Émile Pouget has sort of semi-sunk into oblivion. Whereas Michel, I think she has the sort of staying power somehow.
Well, I think make good copy for the newspapers is the best way. And Louise obviously was performing and had a very colourful reputation, dressing in military uniform, men's clothes in the Paris Commune. You know, anything that sort of caught headlines, really. Do something that's headline catching, you may well be remembered by somebody, a journalist looking for a story 50 years later. But also, I think it's also down to what you do. And I think that there is a way in which we all live on depending upon what we do in life. And that's something that Louise Michel said, that she didn't believe in an afterlife, but she did believe that we survive by what we do in our lives.
Yeah, two questions to both of you. One is the relationship between Michel and Emma Goldman, because she is a similar type in the sense of being a performer. You know, Kathy Ferguson's book is really about Emma Goldman as a theatrical event, and she was. I mean, by the second decade of the 20th century. And the other one is about money again, the connection, and you mentioned Rochefort, wealthy benefactors and anarchism. I mean, I'm thinking about him, but also what was that with him? Because he was a very strange, manipulative man. I think the man who owned the Kodak fortune and the boy preacher from Clerkenwell getting all this money from Kodak, the man who was one of the inheritors of Kodak or something. That's right, yeah. Yeah, a shareholder, whatever. I mean, yeah.
So George Davison, he'd been a shareholder in the company that became Kodak.
Yeah.
They brought a process that he pioneered, and
right.
I think that's how he made his money. Yeah. Oh, right.
That was my.
Again, forgive me if you covered this, but the two knowns most readily associated with her, the Paris Commune, anarchist. Now, maybe you covered this, but do we have detail about the process whereby, not having actually considered herself an anarchist while the Commune was going on her way to New Caledonia, we're led to believe, she concludes that she is an anarchist. Do you have any detail about why that process came about then and how?
Yes, well, it's conversations, particularly with Nathalie Lemonnier, who sort of articulated ideas that were already formulating in her own mind, I think. Some of you may have seen the very good play that Paul Mason put on in South London a couple of years ago, where he sort of concentrates on the women who were exiled in New Caledonia and the conversations that they had before and during their time on the island. And I think that, that is very clearly documented, that that's where Louise Michel's involvement with the anarchist movement originates.
Yeah, I'll reply to Carl. So yes, performance, I think you're right, the parallel's been drawn, and there's a whole argument to say again, the spectacular dimension is a form of female political empowerment in this period and are literally occupying, front stage. But I think, yes, I mean, they met, and I think there was quite a lot of mutual admiration, I think, or at least politeness. I think I'd have to go back to, you're not going to have a feud, but they did meet, I think, when she came. Michel was going to go on tour in the US, a big fundraising operation with Pietro Gori, and it never happened. But, of course, Goldman came to London. And I think about Rochefort, there's always the suspicion that beyond the friendship, she might have been manipulated because, of course, Rochefort used the French anarchist movement quite a lot with the hope of destabilizing the fragile French Republic.
Strategy of tension in some ways.
Yes, absolutely. And that's the only time, actually, when Michel was disgraced in France, because Rochefort was a very anti-Dreyfus. He took the wrong side, definitely. I mean, he was virulently... and yes, exactly. And she sided with him. She refused to disown him. So was it, being true to an old friend? Was there financial interests at stake? Was she deeply manipulated? She was also quite friendly, or at least in touch with the Duchesse d'Uzès, who was another shady far-right monarchist. So yes, an interesting sort of detour again with murky financial implications, yes. See, room for further research.
Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to nub it. I mean, I attended the same play that Martyn did, and I think it got reviewed in a couple of places. And Paul Mason's play was slated badly, but I could have easily seen that being translated into film very, very easily. And I thought it was really good that it was, about women as well. I just think there's been missed a trick there, because I really think it could have worked, especially if it's done by a French producer, because they're particular cinematic techniques. But it's funny, just when I'm listening to this talk, the three details that came out to me, the amount of anarchist activity that happened in this local area. And I've said this at a previous talk before, but only a few blocks away from here, one of the most leading early anarchist theorists lived there with his wife, Mary, and his daughter, Mary Shelley, and his wife is Mary Wollstonecraft. You had, anarchists living up in Islington. You had the anarchist press at the other side of the British Library. You had different types of anarchist activity happening in Tottenham Court Road, in Soho, and all the rest of it. So there are some very good tours about it, but I don't think the definitive one has been done yet, actually. So, I mean, it really brings in, for me, anarchist geography, transnational anarchism, which I think is critically important, personally speaking, and a whole pile of other topics. So, I mean, it's not just about, it's actually about the way that Louise Michel is connected in so many ways to these things. But for me personally, I'd be interested to say, what do you, I know this is a very trite question, but I think it's one that I'm really interested in, is what do you think anarchists today could draw from Louise Michel? Now, I know that in one sense I've landed a bomb on you, so I do apologise.
I would say that that the most important lesson is not to criticise other people's version of what constitutes anarchist activity, because anarchist activity doesn't necessarily involve violent confrontation. And we have here a figure in Louise Michel, who is somebody who obviously was involved in one of the most violent moments of French political history in the 19th century, and yet at the same time her most effective activism was probably as a teacher, as an educationalist, as somebody who was raising money for helping other anarchists and things like that. And I think that there's a tendency within anarchism to criticise other people for not being revolutionary enough, or for this or that particular thing has more revolutionary street cred than some other things. And it's about time we grew up as a movement.
That's very difficult to follow up, actually, because that's very true. Well, she went into exile when she found that politics in France and surveillance was becoming oppressive. So I think the lesson is that don't hesitate to up sticks and go somewhere more liberal when things sour up. Sorry, no, I'm joking. Sorry, but that, there is something about the great anarchist diaspora at the time. I think the main lesson is really it's her integrity. And I think it's, you've said it more articulately, but her commitment and just her deep sense of integrity and devotion to the cause, I think. That's what sticks with me.
Okay, well, unless anybody's got anything particular burning to ask, and I do urge people, if you've got any last minute questions, to come out with them right now. And there's, just to highlight a couple of things in the shop, like we've got our anarchist section is there on the left, and it's in there are books like John Quayle's The Slow Burning Fusion. It's got a very decent anarchist history of London, which again touches on all these areas, and it also mentions things like, different political meetings that would happen with Malatesta down in Holborn Town Hall, right on the edge of Covent Garden. There's actually so many different bits and bobs, and also don't forget that no single bookshop can be absolutely definitive in the selection that they've got. So do be aware of Freedom Bookshop in Whitechapel if you can find it, and also you've got the again, Active Distribution as well, which does a very good service online. And again, if there isn't something that isn't the shelf, we can usually get it in very, very quickly, all things being equal. Also, regarding books, we do things like anarchist study. We regularly stop things like anarchist studies in the different anarchist journals here as well. We do a decent cross-section of anarchist leaflets. So, and again, if you're a leaflet producer as well, come into shop and we'll give it your work serious consideration, because the leaflet is just as can be even more useful in that pithy manner than reading a heavy tome that you can barely carry. So I think that's basically, except a couple of quick last minute announcements. So we've got 3 things coming up in the near future. The first one we've got is News from Nowhere, which occurs down in Leytonstone, and we've got some leaflets here. Their next event is titled On the Edge, Religions and Radicals in Wanstead Flats, and we've got Peter Williams plus Mark Gorman. And we've also got the organiser of that group here in the thing, so you can always pick your brains and all the rest of it. Next thing is, speaking about surveillance, we've a conference on a trade union conference, but everybody else can attend it as well. And it's going to be at the University of Greenwich on Saturday, 16th of November. We've got leaflets at the till as well as the News from Nowhere one, and it's about undercover policing in trade unions, the personal and the political and the personal. And it's going to have the lawyer Gareth Peace, John McDonnell, Matt Rack from the Fire Brigade Union, who's an excellent activist in his own right, and Gil Cartmel from the Unison Union. She's a very good communicator actually, and we've also got. This has to be the advert of adverts. So it's at Freedom Bookshop in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have the excellent Ruth Kinner on the Government of None, discussion and questions in the theory and practice of anarchism. And that's going to be on the 25th of November at Angel Alley. You will not be able to find it unless you remember that it's just to the left of Kentucky Fried Chicken at Whitehall. I mean, at Whitechapel. You've got to look for it. You'll never find it any other way, I swear to God. So I can honestly say that was... There's actually this funny thing, I've been looking forward to this one for weeks, and then you just, in the last few moments, you get this moment of trepidation, you think, have I built it up for that? No, it's just been an absolute delight. So thanks to the audience for questions. Thank you, Constance and Martyn.